Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce Max Beran from Didcot and District U3A. He's our first speaker up with what promises to be a most interesting talk. I've never heard of it. It's called Benford's Law, and I'll pass you straight over to Max then to begin. Thank you, Max.
Okay, share screen. Okay, is that it?
Yes, very good.
Brilliant, thank you.
Right. Yes, so now I've got the bar at the top. So in our Science, Maths and Technology group at the Didcot U3A, we divide the session between a speaker for a first part, and then the second part is sort of a mishmash of up-to-date science and what people want to contribute. And every so often I contribute with a little corner of mathematics. I'm not a mathematician, but various intriguing bits which I think might interest people. And one of them in the year or two back was this one, Benford's Law. They start life as just very short pieces. I've expanded a bit for this occasion to include a bit more of the history of behind Benford's Law, and also a couple of recent applications of Benford's Law, which are very current. So as you'll see there, Benford's Law is a law concerning the distribution of first significant digits of naturally arising numbers. And I'll explain the terminology for those who a bit long departed from mathematics. But so it concerns the sort of numbers that pop up, for example, when you're reading the paper or when you're doing some analysis, some sums, your accounts, or really any area where you're doing calculations. And so here is the eponymous Frank Benford, gave his name to Benford's Law. Here is a jar of Marmite, because some people regard it as so self-evidently obvious that this seemingly ubiquitous observation should be merited by being called a law. So there's an element of love it or hate it about it. I hope most of the people here will find it intriguing rather than screamingly obvious. And here's Benford's Law, of which more anon, but you can see it involves logarithms. So just as a quick reminder of those terminology, what we mean by the first significant digit. Well, this picture on the left shows an extract from a list of files on my PC, of which, of course, there are tens, even hundreds of thousands within the system, especially within the Windows own system. And that's a batch of numbers which just pop up out of somewhere, and they're different file sizes measured in bytes, or is it bits? I'm not sure. And the first significant digit of these numbers is the number on the left. There are occasions where the numbers you're dealing with might be decimals below 1, so the first digit might be 0 in that case, but you ignore that. You go for the first significant digit. It's as if you applied scientific notation and took out everything, but you expressed everything as a number between 1 and 10 times powers of 10. A bit like you do when logarithms, and I suppose I'm talking to a group here, perhaps even the last group, who would have had logarithms as part of their maths education. So that's what we mean by the first significant digit. Um, by naturally arising, it's a bit more of a subtle concept. Um, the we're talking about numbers that, as it says here, pop up unbidden out of nowhere. They're not constructed numbers, not numbers like the house number of your home or telephone number where the numbers stand in for a geographical area, like in the old days when your telephone number started with 3 letters being the name of the exchange. It's really, the numbers are conceptually no different to that. But other than those sort of numbers, I suppose one could argue that there's no reason to suppose that the first significant digit would be other than what you would draw by chance. Why would any one first significant digit be any different from any other? And if you were to draw a histogram of their relative frequencies, you would probably expect to see something like this below, where each of the digits has a 1 in 9 chance of happening, a frequency of 11.1 recurring percent. So, why should 1 happen more often than 2, than 8 or 9? But the big question is, well, is life really like that? And that's what most of this talk is going to be about, how life isn't really like that. And the person who first picked up this as an observation was this man, Simon Newcomb, a very fascinating American, well, Canadian by birth, mathematician and astronomer. He started life in a very modest fashion, but ended it as a very eminent person on both the US and the international scene. But he began life as a herbalist, or apprenticed to a herbalist in his home area of Nova Scotia. But he worked his way up. He sort of worked his way to the States, and he got various jobs close to the centres of power, especially naval power. And he made his name as both as a very practical observer in astronomy, and also well practiced or a well capable mathematician, especially a practical mathematician who was able to convert maths into simple instructions of an algorithmic sort that other people could use. And this was especially useful in his job, which I'll just mention in a moment. But his eminence was recognised internationally. He visited Britain and other points in Europe, and he became an FRS, and he was awarded the Royal Society's Copley Medal, which is the equivalent of a Nobel Prize. Nobel chose not to include maths in his list of what was medalable. And he got numerous honours internationally for services to navigation, and largely because he headed the US Nautical Almanac Office. US Nautical Almanac was set up by way of competition with the British Nautical Almanac, published from Greenwich Observatory, to be independent, but they also had as well as borrowing heavily from that, they had their own programs to suit the requirements of the sailors of the United States, especially the Navy. So he was the boss there, and a very good boss, as it turned out. For those of you who are perhaps not familiar with what a nautical almanac might include, I've got some illustrations here. If you're on speaker view, you'll see I'm holding up a book of navigation tables, um, full of information about the stars in the sky and the longitudes and latitudes. And all these tables and all this data has to be put together from somewhere, and it's the job of the Nautical Almanac Office to do that, and also to produce an annual publication which gives the position for the particular year of the stars in the positions above the horizon on particular dates, in order that the navigation officers can calculate the longitude. So you can see the book there is bound in canvas, presumably canvas borrowed from a canvas sail. This book is from the end of the 18th century and predates Newcomb's day, but they were pretty well advanced even in those times. And you can see a flavour here from the contents table, the sort of things it includes. You'll see the tables for computing the latitude by altitudes of the sun, latitudes for places by looking at facts about the moon, and basic constants, if you like, of an astronomical or a geographical nature. In this case, and I think Nautical Almanac did as well, there are pages of problems, including worked examples that the navigation officer could follow to apply the various tables. And you'll see the ones there are talking about using the moon to evaluate the longitude of the boat's position. Although Harrison and his chronometer has sort of got the name of having totally transformed the calculation of longitude, even from Flamsteed's day, the first astronomer royal, and long before that, a German astronomer Werner had worked out that you could get a figure for longitude by observing the distance of the moon from various stars. And a good part of the documentation in the almanacs of performing that calculation. It had to wait really to have accurate ways of calculating and local timing of the position before you could get accurate value. So it was, but it still did vie quite closely with what was possible with a chronometer. And there you'll see the logarithms. The previous page showed that the actual number of pages occupied by logarithms in this book was about 30 or 40. So it wasn't like your school castles mathematics tables where the logs were just on two sides and the anti-logs had another two sides, because you presenting data to a much higher accuracy, a larger number of decimal places, then the log tables would take several pages. And I sort of labour that point because it gave rise to Newcomb's first framing of what became Benford's law. So as boss of the Nautical Almanac Office, his responsibilities were covered both the production of the almanac, but also in establishing better values for the positions of stars and the orbits of the planets, because they not only used the moon, they also used Jupiter's planets to make navigation calculations. So he was busy with campaigns to obtain improved figures on the constant side, the almanac side, but he also had to organise a great team of computers assistants who would do the sums in order to complete the ephemeris side of the business, the ephemeral numbers, the positions of the stars for a particular year. The office that he ran was in a very insalubrious part of Washington, and almost all his computers worked from home. And Newcomb produced a sort of fascinating reminiscences, which is available on the web because under the Gutenberg system, they've transcribed it. And he talks quite a bit about the computers working from home, and you could really be reading the words of the boss of Uber about the benefits of the gig economy. He was able to say how they were able to choose their own hours, and he didn't have to worry so long as they produced accurate numbers to time. And also it made his job easier in that he could hire and fire, especially the latter, if some of the computers turned out to be less good at their job than they needed to be.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Max. Time's running away with you a little bit.
Oh dear, sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't realise you were going to give me a time limit.
Yeah, we've got another speaker to get in, remember. But yes, if you could just move on, please. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that reminder. Then I will have to rush on very fast. So he anticipated Benford by observing that when the computers returned their log tables, how much more worn the pages were which were dealing with low number leading digits. They were looking up numbers starting with 1 in the log tables much more often than they were looking up other numbers. And this led him to formulate an observation about the occurrence of numbers proportional to their position in log terms. And this, the way he expressed it in verbal ways down at the bottom of the page there, and applying his rule to my Windows file sizes, this is what I got. Something like 30% of the file sizes started with a 1, about 18% started with a 2, and so on, with fewer and fewer entries as you went up the list. So Newcomb, if you like, was anticipated what Benford was later to turn into algebra. This is continuing the theme of the pages, the file sizes, looking at some other data sources. Wikipedia has a handy list of 251 countries with their areas, populations, etc. And if you do a histogram of the leading digits of the areas and the populations, you can see that in this histogram below. And you can see likewise you get about 30% or 0.3 of the examples have areas starting with a 1 and 16 or so percent starting with a 2, etc. And the blue bars, the dark blue bars are the theoretical value, and the other colours are for the different figures. And you might say to yourself, well, this has to be nonsense. What if we express the area in square miles? That would box things up. Or instead of calculating the population by people, you just counted the number of ears, so everything had to be doubled. So all those ones would become 2s or 3s, depending on whether the next number was 5 or less. But you have to remember that although the ones column will lose its all its members to the 2 and 3 columns, they'll be replaced by the 5 up to 9 columns, which will all become one columns. And this scale independence is very fundamental. I was going to say a bit more about the logarithmic spacing, but in view of Steve's comment, I'll rush on. Not only is it scale independent, it also works with different number bases. So I took those Wikipedia numbers, jumbled them all up into a single sample of 1255 numbers, and turned those numbers into hexadecimal. So instead of going from 1 to 9, they go from 1 through 9, then A to F. But the algebraic form of the law, instead of using log to the base 10, uses log to the base 16. And log to the base 16 is very convenient, more so than log to the base 10, especially when you're dealing with the numbers between 1 and 2. Because if you think about it, 2 raised to the power 4 is 16, so the log to the base 16 of 2 is 1 over 4, the quarter power of 16. So it's 0.25. So 25% of hexadecimal numbers fall into this first column. Moving on then to Benford, he was a scientist working for General Electric. Like Simon Newcomb, he had a day job, so this was little more than a hobby really, although it was a very abiding hobby with him. And he published his findings about the frequency of first significant digits in 1938. He mentions this same anecdote of Newcomb's about the wear and tear on log tables, but he doesn't actually give credit to Newcomb. There's no mention of Newcomb in the text or as a reference. He did a lot of donkey work, of which I will come back to in a moment, producing a list of 20,000 first digits from a whole lot of different sources. He presented the formula in algebraic terms, which Newcomb hadn't done. He'd used a verbal formulation. And he'd gone on not just to consider the first digit, but multiple digits. How would the first and second digit? And you might imagine that as you move along within the numbers, they become closer and closer to what you'd expect at the 1 in every 9 or 1 in every 10, because once you get past the first, then you get zeros coming back into the picture. But he had this view of his law as an empirical law, a good fit to the data, and he rather imbued the data as having something of a mystical quality. And many people who encounter Benford's law do rather run away with the idea that, you know, there's somehow the finger of God that's producing this strange pattern of the frequency of numbers. But he related it to the psychological effect that we have more consciousness of the difference between 1 and 2. You have to jump, you have to double things, whereas only going from 8 to 9, well, that's just a small jump. And here at the left you see the list of sources that he used to get his 20,000 numbers. He looked at the areas of river basins and some physical constants and numbers he got out of the newspaper, population figures as I just showed you, demographic data, and he assembled all these numbers and got an average out the bottom, which was close to his algebraic approximation, as he called it. Since Benford, there have been developments. We've seen, just to review it, that Benford's law is independent of scale, independent of number base, can be extended to further digits along the list of numbers in a number. And it does owe at least as much to Simon Newcomb as it does to Frank Benford. There's even something called the Sturgar's Law, I think, or Silgar's Law, which says that the person whose name is attached to a law is seldom the person who announced or wrote down the law. We've noted that not all numbers will follow Benford's law. And surprisingly, random numbers, if you use the rand function on your PC, you will get numbers there between 0 and 1, and their leading digit is truly uniform, the 11.1%. That's the way the numbers have been constructed. So even numbers which are, you'd think, wild, like random numbers, don't necessarily follow Benford's law. So you have to be a bit careful. And that raises the matter of a formal definition of what is a natural number. The phrase used by Newcomb or Benford, he used the used number as his basis for what will follow his law and what won't. And it's not until this century, really, that the mathematicians have come up with a rock-solid way of objectively saying what sort of number will follow Newcomb's, will follow Benford's law and what won't. But it has found an important practical niche in forensic work, especially in accountants looking for possible cooking of the books, because people who are cooking of the books are not conscious of the fact that these found numbers should follow a particular pattern, and they invent numbers which out of their head, which don't necessarily abide by Benford's law. And Tim Harford, the more or less man, he raised a couple of cases a year or two back about the case made by Greece for entry into the Eurozone. The numbers that they used appeared to be invented cooking of the books. But there's two examples I thought I'd present here as current interest. How am I doing for time, Steve? Should I finish?
Just carry on a little bit, Max, just to get through the examples. Thanks.
Okay. So, yes, the Trump team, as you know, have tried very hard to get the recent presidential election declared fraudulent. And one of the tools they used was Benford's law. And one example was the Chicago's electoral results from the subdivisions of Greater Chicago. And they looked at the number of votes for Biden and the number of votes for Trump, and they found that Trump's votes, the red bars on the bottom left there, look a little bit Benford law-like, whereas the Biden vote looked nothing like Benford's law. Excuse me. But this was shown to be nonsense, because you have to remember that electoral precincts are designed to have somewhat similar numbers of voters. We don't want some precincts with having vastly number, and we have the same here with constituency populations. Most constituencies there were around the 500 mark, clustered up and down from 500. And as Chicago is quite solid Biden country, and it's not surprising then that many precincts had first digits of the 300, 400 mark, which is why you got the peak there in Biden's histogram. Donald Trump, on the other hand, Some constituencies hardly voted for him at all, and others were rock solid. So he spanned the range much more broadly, and although it didn't fully fulfil the constraints of Benford's law, it did a whole lot better than Biden's. But nevertheless, as we just explained, it is just an artifact of the way constituencies are drawn. So that's the case where you can't really apply Benford's law. The other one, very recent publication, just in March, about the COVID-19 data coming from Brazil. The history there was that Brazil withdrew its publication of cases and deaths on political grounds, because they felt that the states were overstating the figures in order to increase their funds. But WHO said that wasn't allowed, and the lawyers in Brazil agreed, and they got the numbers reinstated. But the numbers looked cooked, according to this particular group who analysed the data. They departed somewhat from Benford's law, and although it wasn't, as it were, the smoking gun, it did provide sufficient evidence for them to look closer, and on closer examination, more careful analysis of the data, they did find that the COVID-19 cases were seriously underestimated. And this is somehow a classic application of Benford's law as a forensic tool. It seldom does provide a smoking gun, but it does suggest where closer scrutiny is required.
Is this your last slide, Max?
It is, yes.
Oh, okay.
So that's
Thank you
a little bit on Benford's law. Sorry, I didn't appreciate that the time was quite as limited.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Max. That was it's really fascinating, and such a pity that Newcomb didn't really get the credit for all the effort he put in. We don't have any questions in the chat box, so what I'm going to do is unmute everybody. If you'd like to just remove your screen share, please, Max. And we'll ask everybody to unmute themselves. And if you have a question or comment, please raise your hand, your electronic hand, and we should be able to spot you.
Martin Butcher has a question.
Martin, you've got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so sorry, I raised the wrong figure there rather than the raised hand. Etc. But is there a general definition between what is a natural number or not?
Yes, but it's very deep. It goes into sort of group theory and set theory. It's sort of on the borders of logic and maths, which is why it had to wait for this century to be settled. So
Okay.
It's been left really as sort of a heuristic, avoid certain categories of numbers. You need a fairly good span across orders of magnitude. But in terms of would satisfy a professional mathematician, the definition had to wait for this century.
Brilliant. We have Non from Cardiff.
Yes. Sorry, I was trying to clap, and I put my hand up instead. So thank you very much. That was for a non-mathematician who found it a bit of a struggle at the beginning. I was really fascinated by the end, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Non. Good stuff. If there isn't anything else from anyone, then please raise your hand for Max's effort. Really interesting stuff there, and subject I've not come across at all. And I'll pass.
Thank you. Very good.
Yep. Thank you. I'll pass over to Barry now. And shall I mute everybody? And
yes. If you'd like to mute
okay,
everyone.
you will need to unmute, Barry.
Okay, thanks. Right. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. And again, can I add my thanks to Max? Very interesting, and it just shows you that Donald Trump might be able to lie, but the numbers clearly don't. So you know, maths triumphs over myths, should we say? For our second item today, I'd like to welcome David McLellan from my own science group here in Bideford, North Devon. David's a retired college lecturer who specialised in clinical chemistry and haematology. And today he's going to talk about a potential breakthrough in cancer treatment. And it actually makes use of a most unlikely ally given our current predicament, viruses. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David. As again, please use the chat facility to record your questions for afterwards. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me to start with?
Yes.
Yes,
good.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'll share screen. Okay, so what we're talking about are certain viruses that can kill cancer cells. I've avoided the use of can cure cancer because cure is a variously defined word. Cancer is a big beast with many types and subtypes. So I'll restrain myself at the moment, and we might return at the end to consider curing cancer. Okay. Now let's start off by actually looking at the worldwide impact of cancer, which is obviously quite significant. It's one of the largest killers in the world, and significantly, and I think it's important in this world of COVID, that we realise it's something like 3 times as deadly as COVID. Now, in terms of numbers, 18 million new cancer cases each year, of which 10 million die. And this was figures which were published in 2019. I think it's quite significant that in every year, not just this year, cancer kills more people than COVID currently does. Now, what we need to consider is the relationship between viruses and cancer to start with, because it's a double-edged, it's been described as a double-edged relationship, as there are a number of viruses referred to as oncoviruses that can cause cancer, and these include a virus called Epstein-Barr virus. You might be more familiar with this in terms of it causing glandular fever, which is generally a self-limited condition, but it can come back. But it's also associated with a particular form of lymphoma, and this was first described in 1958 by Dr. Burkitt, who was working in Africa. There is some association with with malaria as well. So this particular type of lymphoma doesn't tend to be found in this country, although there are rare cases where it does occur. Another virus that you'd be familiar with or have heard of is the herpes papillomavirus. It's long term, but HPV for short, and its association with cervical cancer in women. And the good news with this one is that we've now got a vaccine which is very, very effective against this. So this is one which is hopefully going to be reduced in the future. And then we also have hepatitis, particularly hepatitis B and hepatitis B and C virus, which can be causative of liver cancer. And it's a particular form of liver cancer. It's primary liver cancer rather than the secondary cancers that occur from other conditions like breast cancer, colonic cancer, etc. And this can actually affect quite large numbers of people around the world, particularly in the Far East and in sub-Saharan Africa. Fortunately, again, in terms of hepatitis B, there is a vaccine, and therefore we will see fewer and fewer cases of this. Unfortunately, at the moment, there isn't a vaccine against hepatitis C virus. However, there are a number of viruses that show a preference for destroying malignant cells. And there's one group which are called reoviruses, and these little chaps have a natural preference for destroying malignant cells. On the other hand, in this new genetic modification age, we can take certain viruses and modify them so that they will selectively kill cancer cells. When they do this, they're acting as so-called vectors. In other words, they're being able to get into the cell, take over its machinery to make more viruses, and also to make any other protein that the virus is capable of making. And all of these viruses are referred to broadly as oncolytic viruses. A little American diagram on the side shows the little viruses, which in fact onco relates to cancer, and lytic means that the cells are being broken down by this explosion of virus production within the cells. We've actually got quite a long history of understanding that viruses can have an effect on cancer. As long ago as 1904, a lady in her middle age who had acute leukemia was seen to have a regression of her disease, only temporary, after she had a virus infection. So there's this suggestion that the virus had actually induced this regression of her disease. This caused quite a lot of excitement, and later on, various so-called native viruses, ones which were not modified by man, were used to treat leukemia and certain solid tumors. However, there were some problems that if the disease didn't kill you, the virus possibly could occasionally. And they found that a lot of people, although they recovered briefly, soon regressed to a cancer state again. And it wasn't until the early, excuse me, it wasn't until 2005 that we've actually got the first man-made or man-modified virus, where we've genetically modified a virus and created an oncolytic virus. And this was first approved in China. Subsequently, one other has been approved, and we'll come on to that one later. It's worth reminding ourselves that viruses act as vectors in a number of ways, and we've exploited them for quite some time. We're really using them as some sort of Trojan horse to smuggle various genetic components that we want to create. And what's basically happened over the years is that we've used it in gene therapy for a number of genetic disorders. For example, you probably all remember the boy in the bubble who had immune deficiency and he couldn't sort of live in the outside world. Well, this was one of the first cases for treating with gene therapy. More recently, there's been a lot of success with treating haemophilia and some success with treating diseases like sickle cell disease. We're all aware now, if we weren't before, about vaccine production and the use of vaccines. And the thing which oncoviruses are related to is a form of therapy, quite a broad therapeutic approach called immunotherapy. And there are several of these that are now coming on the list of treatments, and many of them have got some very exciting results, and they're actually making quite a big impact on certain cancers. Worth reminding at this stage that it's not all cancers that immunotherapy might be able to treat. It might be able to treat certain cancers very well and other cancers less well. But how do these oncolytic viruses, these cell-killing viruses, actually target cancer cells? Well, one of the ways in which they do this is that they differentiate between the normal and the cancer cell in a number of ways. The reduced viral defenses of cancer cells, malignant cells, is a significant factor. Another important factor is that the malignant cells often express receptors which the viruses can attach to in far greater numbers than normal cells do. This isn't always the case. And this enables the virus to bind, and it then enters the cell. When it enters the cell, it takes advantage of the sort of dysregulated mechanisms for growth that a cancer cell has. This is what characterizes a cancer cell. It just so happens that the mechanism which allows the cancer to divide and create a tumor is also a similar process by which viruses actually function. What they actually do is, once they get into the cell, they actually take over the genetic machinery of the cell, in this case a cancer cell, and proliferate rapidly. So much so that the cell gets to a point where it actually disintegrates and releases its content. Now, this rather complex looking diagram, don't get frightened by it. This just gives an indication around the edge. You can see all these little blue starry viruses. These are examples of viruses which actually have been used either naturally as oncolytic viruses, or they've actually been genetically modified. And you'll see that most of them are actually attaching to a receptor, which enables them to then get into the cell. But they don't always use this mechanism. Newcastle disease, for example, they actually fuse directly with the membrane, and this is a non-specific mechanism. The same thing with vaccinia virus, which is one of the ones which is now being commonly used. And this uses a similar process. So it's not using a highly specific receptor. Okay, so we've got our oncolytic virus. This one has possibly the capacity for getting into a healthy cell. However, once it gets in here, it doesn't replicate rapidly, it doesn't cause a disease. And if we actually work on that virus, we can actually remove any disease-creating component. However, if it gets into a tumor, it rapidly replicates, and as I said, eventually it causes the breakdown or the lysis of the tumor. Now, two things then happen. You've got a huge expansion of virus population, which go on to go to another tumor cell, replicate, and then break down. Now, this obviously is great if you can actually administer it directly, for example, to a tumor. You can cause significant destruction of the tumor cells. But what was discovered also is that when you do this, you actually release from the cell components which can be recognized by the immune system. So, you know, the antigens, if you like, of the tumor cell are now being revealed to the immune system. And the immune system can then react and destroy in various ways the tumor. So you've got the tumor being destroyed by the virus, and then the immune process, which is then brought into play, can also destroy it with cells like T cells, which are toxic to the tumors. Right, if we go on to the next slide, we need to think in terms of the other effects that these oncolytic viruses have, because they have a much broader therapeutic effect than just breaking down or lysing the cells. In addition to immune stimulation, which is indicated on the previous slide, they can do the following. They can infect and destroy cells in a very low oxygen environment. Now, this is quite an important capacity, because in a low oxygen environment, which occurs particularly in solid tumors, the cells often don't, the viruses often don't destroy the cells. These oncoviruses, or many of them, seem to have the ability to infect cells even in these rather difficult environmental conditions. The other thing, of course, is that you can not just genetically modify the virus to make it into an oncolytic virus. You can actually use it as a vector to deliver, for example, suicide genes. For example, you can give an inactive drug which is then turned into like a magic bullet, if you like, where the active drug is destroying the malignant cells. It's been used, it can be used as a radiosensitizer that makes the tumor cell far more sensitive to one of the other forms of treatment, which is radiation. And we're now into this situation where we can actually significantly stimulate the immune response by including code, genetic code, for immune stimulators. And these are growth regulators for the immune system. Now, one of the things we want to do, as we said earlier, is we want a virus which can get into malignant cells and destroy them, but doesn't harm the normal cells. Well, if there's any risk of disease causing propensity in the virus, they can be removed by genetic engineering. Furthermore, if we want to incorporate genes which stimulate the immune process, we can do this through genetic engineering. So genetic engineering can take out genes that we don't like, replace them with genes that we can use to actually intensify the response. So how does that leave us in terms of the current therapeutic situation? This seems like a very brave new world, but what are we doing in practice? Are there any out there at the moment that are being used other than in China? Well, currently, there's only one that's been approved by the regulators of America and Europe. This has got the magic name TVEC, also known as Imulgic, and it's a modified herpes virus, and it incorporates the genetic code for an immunostimulant. Now, that immunostimulant has got this rather unusual name, GM-CSF. We've known about this stimulant for many years. We rely on it for producing the cells from the bone marrow that go on to become red cells and white cells. It actually stands for granulocyte, which is one type of or a series of white cells, and also M for macrophage. These are the cells that can ingest bacteria and other particles, but they also can present them to other cells, and they can result in activation of T lymphocytes and make them into superb killing machines. This therapy was approved in 2015, and it's proved to be very effective in a selective number of patients who are suffering from later stages of melanoma. One of the problems with clinical trials is that in order to test them, we tend to test them on people who are at fairly late stages of disease. Not, you could argue, the optimal way of testing for effect. You'd normally want to try and eliminate cancer before it got to stage 3 or 4 rather than stage 1 or 2. However, there are many oncolytic viruses which are currently in registered clinical trials, over 50 in total, and there's a lot of interest in using them in combination with other therapeutic processes like chemotherapy or radiation or some of the other immune therapy mechanisms. And this slide looks very complicated, but on the left-hand side here, where you've got the viral species, this just shows you how many different viruses are being looked at the moment. But if you look at the bigger sections of the viruses in use, adenoviruses, herpes viruses, and vaccinia viruses are the main ones in use, the main ones being looked at the moment. In terms of combination therapy, they're being used either by themselves, monotherapy, or they're being used with some of the other immunotherapy techniques. One's called immune checkpoint inhibition. I won't go into any detail there. But they're also used in combination with the types of therapy that most people are familiar with, which is chemotherapy. And we've tended to use combination therapy anyway with chemotherapy. Many therapies now use a variety of different drugs in different order to actually try and eliminate cancer cells. And of course, radiotherapy, which has been around far longer even than chemotherapy. On the right-hand side, you can see where we're at. When I say where we're at, this was in 2019. So a lot of those trials which were phase 1 are now in phase 2, and those in phase 2 are now in phase 3. So we've got great hopes that there are going to be several of these which are going to be very useful for treating one or more types of cancer. Right, we do need to consider certain other clinical considerations. For example, the cost of therapy. A lot of these therapies are quite expensive. For example, the figures that I've managed to obtain looking through the literature is that a treatment using this VTEC oncolytic virus costs us something like £40,000 per round of treatment. And this is even more if it's used in combination with other immunotherapies. One question for us in the UK is how will NICE respond if some of these viruses are found to be useful? Because there are often problems in actually giving approval for therapies which are highly expensive. And it will depend on how the trials, how useful they've been shown in the trials, how many people responded, how many people are possibly going to be cured. Mode of delivery. Well, at the moment, VTEC is delivered directly. It's injected directly into the tumour site. But there is some evidence that we can use intravenous delivery, and this would give a much more widespread option, and it could be very useful if we're trying to treat secondaries of primary tumours, where they've actually are starting to invade other areas. One of the problems with intravenous delivery and that form of therapy is that there's a tendency for our immune system to try and kill off the virus before it gets into the cancer cell. In point of fact, a lot of the trials which have been conducted so far seem to indicate this is not a major problem, because so much virus is being given at one point in time that even though some of it might be eliminated, there's enough around to get into those cancer cells and destroy them. So, on the right-hand side of this final slide, we have a scanning electron microscopy, SEM, of adenoviruses. Worth reminding ourselves that although that first patient in 1904 had a virus, we couldn't actually see them then. 1932 was the first time we actually had the ability to actually see these viruses. They're obviously a very useful addition to immunotherapy approach to cancer treatment. Their ability to be very selective, in other words, to kill the tumour cells, but not to kill the normal ones, makes them very exciting candidates. Very much within the sort of health service sort of mantra of do no harm. You want the cells, the bad cells to be killed and the good cells to remain. Other capacities, lethal to cancer cells, as we've already seen, can be added to make these much more effective. They can be used either by themselves, or increasingly, we believe they'll be used in combined therapy. So, fascinating times, and we await with interest the imminent result of several promising clinical trials. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks,
Yes.
David. That's brilliant. If you'd like to stop sharing, then we can open it up to some questions. Were there any, Steve, I don't know if you've been monitoring, were there any questions in the chat box? Where's Steve?
Sorry, Barry, I didn't spot any in the chat box. I should have opened up all microphones. Yep, so people can unmute, they can raise their hands and go ahead and comment, ask questions, whatever.
Yes, okay, so are there any, is that Jill Jenkins wants to ask a question? Please, fire away.
Hi, thank you very much. It's a really interesting talk, and it just made me realise how totally ignorant I am of lots of things, obviously to do with viruses. Obviously, my question, because COVID and vaccination is in everyone's minds, and one of the reasons to have the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccinations, they've been saying they're so safe because this mRNA technology has been, is it mRNA? Yeah. Technology has been used in cancer treatments for a long time, and so it's safe. But from your talk, it doesn't seem as as much has been used, or am I going down the different track? Is that a totally different form of therapy?
I mean, to some extent, you're right, because I mean, if you look at the Oxford group, for example, the Oxford vaccine, the company that produces that, which is a spin-off from the university group, have been using their vaccines, or they've been experimenting with these vaccines, and they're actually in clinical trials at the moment for the treatment of cancer. So yes, in other words, the coronavirus was a spin-off, if you like, from the work that they've been doing there. However, they'd also been working with things like Ebola virus and other viruses in terms of producing vaccines.
But does the particular mRNA technology, which is different in the Pfizer vaccine, is that more sort of cutting edge, if you like, than the AstraZeneca type of approach?
Well, there are two things. One, if you look at the Pfizer, they're using what's called a liposome, which is like a little lipid coat which surrounds the messenger RNA. If you did that to these particular viruses, you would actually prevent them from getting into some of the target cells, the malignant cells. It's been suggested. So there is a slight difference when you're using them as a vaccine, as opposed to using them as a killing machine.
Okay,
hope that helps.
Okay, thanks.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I can't find a way of putting a hand up on my screen.
Go to reactions. Go to reactions and raise hand.
Right. Yeah. I haven't got a raised hand.
Ah.
Oh, it's I found it. Sorry. Oh, flipping.
You can ask your question anyway.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I've now lost it altogether. But never mind. My only comment was that in any other situation, I don't think the Pfizer vaccine would ever have been developed because of the required storage conditions. To be honest, it's only because of the urgency of the situation. But normally you would not look at anything that had to be stored at -80. It just wouldn't. It would be a non-starter. And messenger RNA is very unstable, so it has to be stored at a very low temperature, which isn't directly relating to what we've just been talking about, but it's just a comment.
Yeah, very true, actually. Yeah, you're quite right.
And if I can just make a comment at that point, I think this is going to be one of the really big issues when we try and sort of spread the availability of viruses elsewhere in the world. Some of the countries just simply don't have the facility to maintain anything at -70 degrees for any length of time. So that's where the room temperature viruses, vaccines, are going to have to do the donkey work.
Okay, we have Mayor Colley waiting patiently to say something, but your microphone is off, Mayor, and your camera is off. Mayor Colley? Can you unmute? Let's ask up to unmute.
Sorry.
I can hear you, Mayor, but I can't see you.
I'm sorry, it was pressing the wrong button.
Don't worry. As long as David can hear you, go ahead.
I can.
No, I haven't got a question, I'm sorry.
Ah, right.
Okay, you've raised your hand, so okay, I'll lower it.
No.
Anyone else?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
I have my nephew's partner is pretty terminally ill. She has a form of cancer in her stomach. There's obviously saying it's terminal. Is there any way she can get on a trial, or what's the process of getting on a trial, please?
Well, Cancer Research UK have a listing of all the various trials that are underway. Huge,
Okay.
an immense list of them. So you can go online and you can actually look through there and see if there are any trials currently happening.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very useful. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? It's Neil. You talked about the relationship between the cancer cells and the viruses, but is there anything in which you're looking at the requirements of different types of cancer cells and going back towards the viruses? Because it sounds as though a lot of the virus information had come from the viruses being exposed to the cancer rather than looking at the cancer and then looking at suitable route towards a virus of some sort or virus modification, or is that not really an appropriate thought about it?
I think what you want is a virus that can identify particular, I mean, not all viruses recognize the same targets, in other words, the same cancers.
Yeah.
So you want viruses which will actually link on to those specific receptors in most cases, and then get into the cancer cell. Once they get in there, they will then just use their normal proliferative capacity and also the capacity, sort of like the engine of the cell itself, which is actually proliferating rapidly, to actually produce lots and lots more viruses. So I mean, that's the mechanism we're talking about. So there is some degree of specificity in that they have, most of them need to get to attach themselves to a target in much the same way as coronavirus has to use the spike protein to attach itself to the to its target.
Okay, Peter.
Leading on from that, several of your examples of the oncoviruses were from animal diseases.
That's right.
Do you think they give a better chance of being safe, or I mean, they're specialized for not infecting human cells, so do they offer an advantage?
They could offer an advantage there, but they also offer a particular advantage, particularly initially, and this is also being used in vaccines. I mean, that they will actually, you don't make an immune response to them initially. I mean, we're very used to having adenoviruses. We have, you know, they affect our adenoids and tonsils, etc. And therefore, we doubtless most of us have made antibodies to them. So there's always the likelihood that we're going to neutralize some of these viruses if they're being used therapeutically. However, as you rightly say, if you use an animal virus, you can overcome that. But it may only be initially. If you have to use several courses of therapy, the person may eventually produce antibodies. And they're also using plant viruses, looking at plant viruses as well.
Okay, we've got a question from Peter, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, may we have copies of your slides, please, David?
Yes, as I think has been mentioned before, I'm slightly conscious that some of these are borrowed figures.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
I was trying to make notes as we went through, and at one point we were talking about TVEC, and then we were talking about VTech.
Oh yes, I think TVEC, was it?
Quickly.
Right.
Can you just explain that again, please?
It is TVEC. TVEC it is, yeah.
It is TVEC, not
it
VTech.
It is TVEC, yeah.
Lovely.
TVEC.
Yeah.
Very observant. Robert Bernardi.
Right. My question is slightly off topic, but could you throw some light on why viruses evolve? You know, why you get, you know, that they're constantly changing. Yeah. And this coronavirus, you know, it's thrown up, say, this Indian variant, but why do viruses evolve when they're inanimate?
Evolution.
Yeah.
In practice.
Yeah, I mean, it is evolution in practice, and because they rapidly replicate, you know, you will get millions and millions of virus particles which will be susceptible to minor change. Some viruses are very stable and they hardly mutate at all. Others, like the coronavirus, appear to be sort of, I would say, intermediate in terms of that. I mean, we've got some viruses we can hardly cope with at all because they mutate so much. I mean, flu virus isn't particularly clever. And we've never been successful in getting viruses against the common cold.
Can I just butt in at this point? I'm looking at the clock and we're getting up towards lunchtime. Can I just, with regard to Robert's question, I happen to know, because I'm a good friend of his, that David's actually got to talk about virus variants. He prepared a talk for our group a few months ago about COVID variants, in fact. So maybe, David, you'd be willing to come back on a later date to give that talk?
Yeah, if people would like that, yeah.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. I see thumbs up.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if there's no more questions, I'll just make a few remarks to bring this to a close. Our next meeting is going to take place 4 weeks from today on Wednesday the 9th of June. As always, it's open to any of you to put yourselves forward to make a presentation. Doesn't need to be a long one, sort of 10 or 15 minutes if that's all you wanted to talk for. But if you would like to volunteer, you can let us know via the website. There's a chat box and contact us button, or you've got our emails from the notes we sent out. So just drop us a line. While I'm talking about the website, I don't know if many of you have visited it recently, but we've now got a number of other groups set up in U3A communities that you might be interested in. Two of them are kind of offshoots from this group, actually. If anyone's interested, particularly in space exploration, we've actually got a specialist rocket science group. And that meets once a month. I forget which day, but if you go on the website, you'll find more details there. If any of you are into or were into amateur radio, we've actually got a group for that. So I wasn't aware that people were still doing amateur radio, but apparently they are. And the other thing I want to mention is we're very soon going to be launching a climate change group. It's still in development, but watch this space, and I'm sure there'll be a meeting in the next month or two. I'm going to finish in a moment. Obviously, I'd just like to thank Max and David for their talks this morning.